In 1928, a London hospital threw away a contaminated Petri dish. Inside that mold was penicillin, a substance that would save over 200 million lives. But here's what they don't tell you in history class. For nearly 2 decades after its discovery, that miracle drug was effectively reserved for soldiers, elites, and those who could afford what most couldn't. The pattern didn't start there, and it didn't end there either. What you're about to discover is how nearly every major medical breakthrough in modern history followed the same trajectory, and why that trajectory reveals something uncomfortable about who gets to live and who pays the cost of waiting. Welcome to the Wealth Timeline, where money, power, and history quietly shape the world around us. Because the story of medical innovation isn't just about science, it's about access, timing, and the invisible economics of survival itself. Picture the world in 1940. Warfare on an industrial scale, infection killing more soldiers than bullets, and, in a handful of laboratories across Britain and America, scientists racing to mass produce a fungal extract that could stop bacterial death in its tracks. Penicillin worked. The data was undeniable, but production was expensive, slow, and required resources most nations didn't have during wartime rationing. So a choice was made, not through legislation or public debate, but through quiet allocation. Military first, government officials second, civilians eventually. At the time, this seemed justified, rational even. What no one openly acknowledged was the precedent being set, that life-saving innovation would be distributed not by need, but by strategic value. And that precedent would define medical access for generations. The modern pharmaceutical industry didn't begin with altruism. It began with scarcity economics. In 1942, the United States War Production Board took control of penicillin manufacturing. Every dose was tracked, every vial accounted for. The drug was classified alongside munitions and steel, a strategic wartime asset. By 1943, American pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and Merck had developed deep tank fermentation techniques that increased production 200-fold. The cost to produce penicillin dropped dramatically. But the price? That remained high, because the companies involved had invested millions under government contract, with the implicit understanding that exclusivity would follow. Patents were filed, production methods were classified. And when the war ended in 1945, those same companies transitioned from military contractors to private monopolies. The assumption at the time was straightforward. Innovation required profit motive. If companies couldn't recoup investments, they wouldn't take risks on unproven treatments. It was a deal made in the name of progress. But here's what that deal actually created. A system where access to medication was determined not by medical necessity, but by purchasing power. A black market for penicillin emerged almost immediately. In post-war Europe, a single dose could cost the equivalent of a week's wages. In rural America, patients traveled hundreds of miles to find doctors who had supply. It worked. The drug saved millions, but only under conditions that would not last. By the 1950s, the model was set. Pharmaceutical companies operated on a predictable cycle. Discover, patent, price high during exclusivity, then allow generics once patents expired. Insulin, developed in 1921, priced as a luxury until the 1970s. Polio vaccine, announced in 1955 by Jonas Salk, who famously refused to patent it, asking, "Could you patent the sun?" Yet, even without a patent, distribution was uneven. Wealthy suburbs received vaccines within months. Poor urban neighborhoods and rural areas waited years. Kidney dialysis, invented in the 1940s, commercially viable by the 1960s. But machines cost tens of thousands of dollars, and treatment required 3 sessions per week indefinitely. So hospitals created God committees, panels of doctors, clergy, and community members who decided which patients deserved access based on perceived social worth. If you were young, employed, and had dependents, you had a chance. If you were elderly, unemployed, or deemed less valuable, you were denied. This wasn't conspiracy, it was policy. Each breakthrough produced real miracles, lives extended, suffering reduced, diseases eradicated. But each success introduced the same unintended consequence. Temporary solutions that only worked for those who could afford the entry price. The stronger the system became, the harder it was to question. By the 1970s, the tension was impossible to ignore. Activists, patients, and even some doctors began asking an uncomfortable question. If medical technology exists, who has the right to restrict access based on price? The HIV/AIDS crisis forced the question into public view. In 1987, the FDA approved AZT, the first antiretroviral drug shown to slow the progression of AIDS. It was a monumental achievement. The annual cost per patient? $10,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $26,000 today for a single medication that had to be taken daily, indefinitely. Manufacturer Burroughs. Wellcome argued the price reflected research costs and risk. Activists pointed out that much of the foundational research had been publicly funded through the National Institutes of Health. Protests erupted. ACT UP demonstrators stormed the New York Stock Exchange. Sell Wellcome became a rallying cry. Nothing collapsed. And that was the problem. Because the system absorbed the outrage, prices dropped slightly, access expanded incrementally. But the underlying structure remained untouched. The logic was still the same. Innovation justified exclusivity, and exclusivity justified price. What changed wasn't the system. It was public awareness that the system existed at all. The breaking point didn't arrive as a single event. It arrived as an accumulation, a critical mass of contradictions the system could no longer contain. In 2015, Martin Shkreli's Turing Pharmaceuticals acquired Daraprim, a 62-year-old drug used to treat parasitic infections in immunocompromised patients. Overnight, the price increased from $13.50 per pill to $750, a 5,000% increase for a drug whose patent had long expired, whose research costs had been recouped decades earlier, whose production cost was estimated at less than $1 per dose. Shkreli defended the decision on CNBC, arguing it was standard industry practice, just more visible. And he was right. Insulin prices had tripled between 2002 and 2013, despite no significant changes to the formula. EpiPens increased 500% between 2007 and 2016. Cancer treatments regularly cost over $100,000 annually. The difference was that Shkreli said the quiet part out loud. He revealed what had always been true. Medical innovation had become an asset class, a vehicle for wealth extraction, not just wealth creation. From this point on, the outcome was no longer optional. Public trust had fractured, legislative pressure mounted, and the pharmaceutical industry faced a reckoning it had spent decades avoiding. So who benefited? Pharmaceutical companies posted record profits throughout the 2000s and 2010s. Executives received compensation packages in the tens of millions. Shareholders saw consistent returns even during economic downturns. And who absorbed the cost? In the United States, medical debt became the leading cause of personal bankruptcy. Patients began rationing insulin, skipping doses to stretch supply. GoFundMe became, effectively, a crowdsourced healthcare system, with over $650 million raised annually for medical expenses by 2020. Globally, the pattern was even starker. Antiretroviral therapy that cost $10,000 annually in the US was reverse engineered and produced in India for under $300. Generic drug manufacturers in Bangladesh, Brazil, and South Africa challenged patent laws, arguing that public health emergencies justified overriding intellectual property rights. The World Trade Organization's TRIPS agreement, designed to protect pharmaceutical patents internationally, became a battleground. Countries invoked compulsory licensing, provisions to manufacture generics without permission. Power shifted, not through revolution, but through attrition. As the cost of maintaining monopolistic pricing exceeded the reputational damage, companies began negotiating tiered pricing structures. Drugs cost more in wealthy nations, less in developing ones. The system didn't collapse. It adapted. But the adaptation revealed what had been hidden. Healthcare access had always been a negotiation, not a right. And negotiations favor those with leverage. Today, the pattern continues in new forms. Gene therapies for rare diseases now cost over $2 million per treatment. Personalized cancer immunotherapies run $500,000 annually. Longevity research, once dismissed as science fiction, now attracts billions in venture capital, with early interventions already priced for ultra-high net worth individuals. The question isn't whether these technologies will exist. It's whether they'll be accessible before patents expire, before generics emerge, before public pressure forces concessions. History doesn't repeat events, it repeats incentives. And the incentive structure hasn't changed. Maximize revenue during exclusivity, then allow broader access once profits decline. The cost of that structure isn't measured in dollars alone. It's measured in years, in lives delayed, in the quiet mathematics of who gets to benefit from innovation first and who waits. 2 takeaways. First, every system that restricts access to life-saving innovation creates a wealth divide, not through cruelty, but through economics. Second, the gap between discovery and distribution isn't accidental. It's structural, and it persists because it's profitable. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden chapter of history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the Wealth Timeline, and turn on the bell icon, because the next story might just change how you see power itself.